to peace runs through the wreckage of our past. I'm your host, Shreya. On today's Inner Peace Better Health, we welcome Dean A. Patrick, author of God Money, former Stanford student, crypto hedge fund founder, and a man who's lived the whole extremes of success and suffering. After a drug induced psychosis, psychiatric hospitalization, and a long journey through recovery, Dean turned inward, finding redemption through Zen, meditation, and radical self inquiry. This is a story of breakdown, awakening, and the quiet power of presence. Welcome, Dean. I'm honored to have you on my show.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for the wonderful introduction. I think you said it better than I could.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your kind words. And Dean, your story starts in a whirlwind Stanford dropout, crypto hedge fund, and then a psychiatric ward. Looking back, what do you think you are really chasing?
Hmm. I think I was chasing a wholeness.
Okay.
I think that I've come to understand that I think all desire on some level is a longing for the heart to return to rest, right?
Yes.
There's an unease that bubbles up. And in my early 20s, that was a very powerful unease and insecurity. And so at the most fundamental level or a fundamental level, I just wanted to feel good. I just wanted to feel at peace and happy and fulfilled in my life,
Mm.
you know? And the way that I went about that was not very smart, or it
Yes.
wasn't very effective, I should say. And I think it was in the context of being at Stanford in a very entrepreneurial world, a university within Silicon Valley, in this startup ecosystem, that the way that people went about improving their lives was starting businesses, investing in startups, becoming venture capitalists. And so that was the path I took.
Yeah. And that's such a raw and revealing reflection. And how did you uh, how did the collapse become the opening for your recovery journey?
Yeah, I mean, so it took a while. I was a drug addict, developed a drug addiction in college that was particularly stimulative, helped me stay up late, study longer, then it started to turn dark and kind of became my only tool for making myself feel normal again. And as I started hedge fund, it was fairly successful actually, raised $1 million. This was 8 years ago. And the fund was doing well for the first 9 or 10 months. I think we like tripled the basis. And so I was like, there was nothing to tell me that my life was on the wrong track until the market turned. And in 2018, the market collapsed. The fund went under. And the last thing that was kind of holding up this idea that my life was on the right track went away because the money wasn't there. I was a broke, a broke drug addict who, didn't even have a fund anymore to say, hey, I'm a success. And so then I went to rehab, and that began the journey of recovery, which continues today, right? That was 7.5 years ago. And, I continue to integrate practices in my life to promote healing and sobriety.
Yeah, that's such a profound truth. And letting go of that control to find the peace takes a real courage. And thank you for sharing your story. And you have embraced Zen Buddhism. How has its philosophy shaped your healing, especially around control and identity?
Hmm, that's a wonderful, wonderful question. Yeah, so Zen, fundamentally, I have so much gratitude for Zen practice because it has been the foundation of the deepest part of my sobriety, which is basically a spiritual sobriety. And you asked about Zen philosophy, and like every spiritual tradition, essentially, Zen is centered around an insight into the oneness of all things, into the interconnectedness of all beings, animate or inanimate. And the way that you go about realizing that insight is you let go of this idea of your separate self. So you look deeply into your direct experience and you find that this constructed sense of self is a, and the only way that you can really do that, at least in my experience, is to quiet your mind, focus and develop concentration. And at that point, you're able to one degree or another, let go of this idea of self for at least a moment, right? And then it comes, in my experience, it comes rushing right back.
Yes.
But so it's a constant experience, it's a constant interplay of letting go, having to come back and letting go again. And so Zen practice to me is a continual process of letting go.
Yes, yes, yes. And that's such a profound shift, like letting go of that control. That's really takes courage. And what is one Zen principle that keeps you grounded on hard days?
Hmm. Well, the number one Zen principle that keeps me grounded on hard days is impermanence, right?
Yes.
So everything, the nature of life is change. And it's not just Zen that teaches that, right? It's Hinduism and Zoroastrianism and even Christianity to some extent. Um, so our experience is one of constant flow. There is nothing fixed in our experience. And so that's a tremendously optimistic thing, because if you're experiencing depression or loss, or some sort of tragedy in your life, uh, that experience, is inevitable, right? We all die, we all lose loved ones, we all, experience loss. But the pain that is associated with that is also temporary. And it also makes space for new beginnings, which, can be more beautiful than what was there before.
Yes, yes, yes. And this is a very really interesting insight that when we lost something and we feel that it's the time to give up, that is the time mean to restart our life and not to give up. And you mentioned recovery as filled with self-induced suffering. What does that mean to you, and how did you start breaking that cycle?
Yeah. Yeah. So an addiction, in my experience, was a process of basically narrowing my consciousness, right? So using drugs condensed my awareness down to kind of a very tight window.
Okay.
And that was useful to some extent for focusing on work, right? I would just be zeroed in, but my consciousness wasn't clued into any sense of interconnectedness. I felt like a very isolated entity. I felt like I was on an island. And I think the foundation of perhaps all suffering is that fundamental loneliness of separateness.
Yeah.
When you feel like your suffering is unique to you, that you're not a part of something bigger than yourself, that is a very dark to be in. And it's also not true. It's never true. But we can convince ourselves that that's the case, if we're not aware of practices or have a community or people around us that are reminding us and supporting us in the practice of realizing and waking up to this deeper reality.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's such a honest insight. And naming self-induced suffering is the first step to the freedom. And thank you for sharing your experience. And from there, I have a question like, what's the role of forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, in true healing?
Yeah. Yeah. That, I think that's part of letting go, right?
Yes.
We, as an addict, and everyone experiences this to some extent, but for addicts, we have a lot of baggage, right? There's a lot of things that happened during the midst of addiction, hurting other people, where we can often feel a lot of shame. I felt tremendous shame coming out of my addiction, to the point where it was hard to sleep at night. You know, I was afraid of going to bed because that was when when my thoughts got loud. Shame was very strong. And that was a trigger to want to go back to my drugs, right? Because that would allow me to hide the shame.
Mm.
But that self-forgiveness comes from accepting ourselves, accepting the fact that we did those things. Um, and when you're an addict, there's a process in the 12-step recovery program where you go around and you atone for things you did. You talk to people you hurt, and sometimes they forgive you, and sometimes they don't. And that's fine.
Yes.
But then just putting that out there is an important step in forgiving yourself.
Yes, yes. And I think it's very important to forgive ourselves first than anyone else do, and let go all the baggage. And I think this will help our listeners so much. Whoever going through this kind of phase and situation, this will really help them so much. And like from high stakes world of like invasive finance to quiet meditation, how did you begin to value stillness over stimulation?
That's a wonderful question. Yeah, that continues to be a practice, I think. Well, it really happened for me when I went to the monastery, right? I went to a Zen monastery here in the United States. And um, that was a time where, I had meditated at home. I had looked at teachers online, listened to Dharma talks, but it wasn't until I actually went to the monastery initially for a week-long retreat that I was able to develop a level of stillness on the retreat, on the silent retreat, where I was able to glimpse the spaciousness and the peace of deep meditation practice. And it was like this moment of just like, wow, this is the most profound, beautiful experience I've ever had in my life that is so much better in a way than certainly being on drugs and,
Yeah.
being engaged in a stimulating environment. So basically, it just felt better. I mean, that's just what it comes down to. It just felt better.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, absolutely. And that's such a powerful contrast, like choosing stillness in a world that rewards noise that is radical. And
it is.
for yes, and for someone listening to this who is in the middle of their own breakdown or lost or in addiction, what would you say to them right now?
Well, it would depend on the circumstance, but I think recognize that it's okay, that you're all right, that no matter how deep in it you are, it's okay. That stillness and that peace is still available to you, even in the midst of active addiction, even in the midst of hurting yourself and hurting other people. It's still there. And at the highest level, the problems, right? This is your karma. This is your makeup that's led you here. And at the end of the day, all suffering is grace, I believe, because it leads you towards a journey of healing eventually. Um, and some people don't make it out of addiction; they do die in the midst of addiction. And I believe that those lives have a purpose too, right? They serve as examples to other people, warnings to other people, and I think that's also incredibly valuable. Now, I wouldn't want that to happen to anybody, and I think recovery is possible for everyone. But fundamentally, that suffering, when you recover, you'll look back on it and be grateful for it. Hard to imagine, but I'm actually very grateful I went through my experience of addiction because it led me to where I am today.
Yes, yes. Your words holds really so much power and hope, and thank you for reaching into the dark with the light. And with that, I have another request. Like, what is a small practice you would refer to help them to return to peace?
The most foundational practice in Zen Buddhism is breath practice, right? The Buddha was following the breath when he attained his awakening. And so it's really as simple as sitting down with your back straight, and you can do it anywhere in life, but it's better to sit down and in a quiet space and bring your attention down into your belly and just follow your breath going in and out. And you can just say in and out, right? You can use those words, especially if your mind is very loud. It's helpful to add kind of a thought along with the breath, just to kind of take away from those other thoughts, right? So just go in and out, and you can count the breath. You can count to 10, and you'll probably lose track quite a few times, but just restart at 1. And the breath will take you all the way. You don't need any other practice besides practice. Now, there's a lot of other practices out there that are wonderful too, but it's really the most foundational practice because it's always there. You're always breathing, and the breath is always in the present moment, right? Our thoughts are in the past and the future, but the body is always right here. And if you tune into that, then you can touch into that piece.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing so much, and thank you for enlightening our listeners. So, after this, if our listeners want to connect, then what's the best way?
Yeah, well, I have a book out talking about my journey. It's called God, Money, Lost and Found in the Crypto Wilderness. And you can find it, you can order it all around the world on Amazon. You can get the audiobook, which has been read by me. You can get the ebook. So you can go to Amazon and search that, or just Google. And it talks about my journey all the way from Stanford, from growing up wanting to be a Christian missionary to a drug addict at Stanford to a Zen practitioner. And I think there's some good lessons there.
Yes, and I'll make sure to attach all the details and the links below so that our users can find them easily. And with that, thank you, Dane, and to our listeners. Dane reminds us that peace isn't found at the peak of success. It's often uncovered at the rock bottom. His journey from psychosis to presence, from illusion to insight, is proof that healing isn't just possible, it's powerful. So breathe deep, sit still, and remember, sometimes the greatest breakthrough starts with simply coming back to yourself.